Well, I've edited rail since 1995, so that's the 16th year. It is of interest, is you mentioned that is a long time, and it's worth mentioning right up front that editors normally can have quite a short shelf life in a given role. Because if you're editing a magazine that's about a cyclical subject, then when you've done it several times, then it's usually time for fresh blood on it. Where I've been particularly fortunate is that the modern rail industry since privatisation has pretty much outdone Doctor Who, David Bowie and Madonna in terms of reinventing itself and regenerating every few years, which has given me a completely new subject to look at, which is of relevance. There's no 2 days the same. I mean, that's part of the appeal of the job. One day I could spend 5 days a week in London chasing around seeing senior contacts, and because rail is the market leader in the modern railway, that can be the Secretary of State for Transport or the Transport Minister, the Chief Executive of Network Rail, the rail regulator, all those sort of people. They all tend to be in London, so I can spend a full week maybe doing that editor-at-large stuff, and then 3 days at my desk in press week, reading proofs, knocking the magazine into shape, writing my editorial. And that is, as a fortnightly magazine, that's every 10 working days. So every other Wednesday we have to put 80 pages to bed, and that is relentless, and I've done that for the last 16 years. Sometimes it can be very similar. It depends on the publishing company concerned. But in general, a managing editor has a role beyond the purely editorial in the management of the magazine, and there is a clue in the name. So in my case, as you know, we also run the National Rail Awards, the National Rail Conference, the Rail 100 Breakfast Club. We run the Britain's Railways Annual Directory, which we've done for the last 12 years, and we do a variety of other on-spec events. Next year we're working on a huge event with the National Railway Museum at York called Railfest in 2012. So I mean, I have a role in sort of managing those events from a financial point of view. Dealing with the awards and all those events also gives a managerial aspect to the financial side of the magazine, so it's not just the words and pictures. An editor-in-chief tends not to have those aspects. An editor-in-chief's responsibilities will stop with the words and pictures on the page, and very often you'll find an editor-in-chief is responsible for a group of magazines and maybe has editors working for him. But the management aspects of the magazine in terms of publishing, finance, are usually excluded from that role. Entirely by accident. I've only ever applied for one job in my life, and that was my very first job as a trainee reporter on the Westmoreland Gazette, and that was because I had nothing better to do. I'd done my final year at university, and I'd gone back to the Lake District to work on the steamers on Lake Windermere, and as it got to the end of August, I would have been going home, 3:24 then, and I was glancing through a copy of the Westmoreland Gazette, and there was an advert in there for a trainee reporter, and I happened to be just what they wanted and drifted into that. Did that for a couple of years, and then got an opportunity with IPC as assistant editor of Steam World, which was a bit of a jump. I went from an unqualified trainee to number 2 on a national magazine overnight. And then since then, opportunities have come from the direction I least expected them at the time that was least convenient. That process took me to Steam Railway in 1992 in March. And I gave myself 6 months to sort that magazine out. It was in a bit of a state at the time, and it took me 3 years. And then in the middle of 1995, my boss asked me if I wanted to edit rail, and the answer was no, I didn't. I'd got Steam Railway sorted out, and we were really enjoying it. I'd always done historic stuff, but he wanted to move the magazine from being essentially a train spotter's gazette, and there's nothing wrong with that. To be a bit more business focused and looking at the more political and financial and the railway in its more rounder sense, and he thought I could do a good job at that. And he asked me on a Wednesday afternoon, and I said, well, at least I'll think about it. When do you want an answer? And he said, in the morning. And the following morning I sat in his office and I heard this voice say, OK, Clive, I'll give it a go, and I realised that was me. And it really was that silly, but absolutely no regrets about it. To have edited rail on a very serious note since 1995, through all the various iterations of rail track, Network Rail, the coming and going of the Strategic Rail Authority, all the accidents, of course, that took place, starting with the Channel Tunnel fire in 1996 and going through Hatfield and Heck and Potters Bar, I've stood at the trackside at all those accidents and done lots of media comments on them, and then sort of grey rig and all the rest of it. There's the old cliche that journalism is the first draft of history. Well, it is. It's fact. And to be in the front row and to have commented and on occasions had an influence on an industry which I care passionately about, there can be no greater privilege, or it's a kind of a drug for a journalist. We've got the magazine as a team into the position where it is taken very seriously by the industry and indeed government. And it is quite seductive to get a phone call from the DFT press office and is it possible you could call in for a chat with the Secretary of State? You'd like to have a, you know, who wouldn't if you're interested in trains? And I've been doing that with every Secretary of State bar for Jeff Hoon, who wasn't there long enough, and Ruth Kelly, who didn't do sort of private one-to-ones. I've done that with all the Secretaries of State, going back to Stephen Byers. You know, I got to know Alistair Darling very well over the 4 years that were there, and it's when you start doing that sort of thing, there's a magazine editor and a journalist, you realise how the system works. I knew Alistair pretty well, and he heard at one stage that I was also talking to the Welsh Transport Minister, Kim Howells, and he said, look, I'm quite happy with you talking to Kim, but I don't want you to stop coming up here to talk to me. And I said, well, quite flattering, Alistair, why is that? And he said, because you're one of the few people that walk through that door that actually tells me what he thinks rather than what I want to hear. Yes, but it's not essential. If you've got somebody who knows railways and that gives them a passion to really, and as we have, as you know with the time you've spent with us, yes, it helps. Is it essential? No. I like to think I could apply myself to other subjects if I wanted to, with equal sort of success and enthusiasm and all the rest of it. If you've got an empathy, you've got to have an empathy for the subject. You can't write about a subject and be taken seriously if you either don't like or don't understand. Now, you don't have to love a subject yourself, but you have to understand why other people do. So if you think that train spotters are all nerds, you'll never make a good railway journalist, because there's a lot of parallels between train spotting and bird watching. I mean, I like to think I could make a reasonable hash on a bird watching magazine, because there's actually quite a bit of similarity. At that end of the interest, people stand in uncomfortable, wet places waiting for something unusual to come along. There is no difference in that case between ornithology and train spotting. So, you know, there's lots of crossovers. It is very difficult to tell, because I will not breach their names here, but there are lots of very senior railwaymen who are railway modellers and as enthusiastic. I mean, some very obvious ones are well known. Adrian Shooter, one of the most successful privatisation managers of the latter era, has got a 2-foot gauge steam railway in his grounds in his house in Buckinghamshire, and he bought one of the Darjeeling engines and he runs on it. Rod Stewart is a passionate rail enthusiast, but there's lots of senior railways. So where do you draw the line? Because very often these are the same people. So it's not like you've got professional railwaymen and enthusiasts. Very often they are one and the same. Now, in other areas of operation, like motorcycling, cars and aviation, that's not unusual and people seem to accept it. But it seems a bit odd in railways. People think that, oh, you can't be a train spotter if you're a professional. It's the pejorative sense of train spotter that does the damage. You know, you're interested in a lively technological industry. If people could see beyond the prejudices, they'd get it a bit more. No, I think there are challenges, and a lot of magazines are failing to meet those challenges. You can't put a website in your briefcase, you can't put a binder on the shelf, and people still do like to do that. They do like, there is something very tactile about a magazine. That's portable and all the rest of it, that you can read and absorb at length and all that sort of thing, that you can't do with a website. Websites are for the assimilation of the headlines very quickly. What magazines can't do anymore is, other than, say, an interview, which, like, as I recently had the first interview with David Higgins at Network Rail as a new chief executive, you can use the word exclusive. You very rarely get to use the word exclusive on a news story now, because news is usually out and around the world. But what we have developed is a technique whereby people who are interested in the railway know that when rail comes along, they'll get the full story, the accurate story, the analysis, the comment, the opinion, and the real facts. So what they see online and in the newspapers, we were getting emails and letters from people saying, yeah, well, of course I knew what was going on, but I knew once rail came along, I'd get the full SP. A magazine's a good format for getting a lot of information across, whereas a website is, a 5,000-word interview, which people will absorb in a magazine. They're different. There are plenty of challenges, and it's a lot harder than it was. But no, I don't think magazines will die. Look, it's the best career in the world. You know, if you love a subject and you like people, journalism is just unbeatable. You'll never be particularly rich, but you will not sit at a desk forever and do the same thing. My old gran, who sadly is no longer with us, used to say something which I didn't understand at the time, but I do now. She said, if you love what you do, you'll never do a day's work in your life.